The frost had crusted the edges of Turner's garage like sugar on an old pie, and Michael Turner moved through it with the practiced economy of someone who had learned to make every motion count. He stood under the breath of the heater, a pipe that coughed steam into the dim air, and cupped his hands around a wrench as if it were a small, steadying prayer. Outside, the town's main street lay white and muffled. Inside, oil and coffee mingled in the low light, the smell as familiar to him as his own name. His daughter's drawing, a crayon sun and a crooked blue car with big happy wheels, was taped to the workbench with a stippled strip of masking tape. He glanced at it the way a sailor checks a chart, then bent to the engine again. If this story finds you, stay with it to the end. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so more stories like this can find you. He had not expected a luxury sedan to be the thing that changed his life. It was a dull, hurried sound that came before the light, a key turned in the wrong way, a hesitant cough from an engine that did not know the town, and then a car eased up the street, tires whispering on frost. Michael had been tightening a belt on an old pickup when a woman in a wool coat stepped out of the car and hesitated, phone clutched like a raft. She looked over the hood as if she were reading the face of a foreign thing. Her heels sank into the snow and left tiny, regular prints that seemed wrong in front of the garage, where boots and grease usually made one single pattern. Use, not ornament. He wiped his hands on a rag, the motion as automatic as breathing, and stepped out. The cold cut through the wool of his jacket, but he did not notice it at first. He noticed only the way the woman's breath fogged the air, and the way her jaw tightened with a problem she had not expected to solve with her hands. She had a presence that moved like glass in light, ordered, precise, made for rooms where everything had its name. "Afternoon," she said, voice careful, not assuming the town would answer back. She tried the key again, and the engine coughed and surrendered. "Afternoon," Michael echoed. He studied the badge at the grill, a maker's mark that usually lived in glossy brochures and boardrooms, not on his patch of Main Street. "Battery?" he asked. It came out a question because asking could be safer than guessing. She shook her head. "It started fine an hour ago. It just—" The words faltered. She glanced past him toward the garage door, where a small dog in a neighbor's yard barked its impatient welcome. For a moment she looked almost like someone who had mislaid a part of herself and was discovering the loss. "I'm late." He looked past her to the driver's seat and saw a folded piece of paper tucked under the visor, a child's name scribbled in a looped hand. He pictured a family routine, departures, arrivals, the skimming of days like stones. He did not often meet strangers whose life had been so carefully arranged. The town's cars were practical. They had the smell of snow and work. This one smelled faintly of a citrus air freshener and a perfume that reminded him of the restaurant where Emily had once splashed sauce across her sleeve and laughed, her small face shining. Michael opened the hood because he could not help himself. His hands had been taught by machines and by necessity. He listened to the engine, felt for the rhythm through metal and wires. It shivered like an animal. Something in the ignition circuit had gone soft. He traced the fuses with a fingertip, checked the connections that weather gnawed at. The problem was subtle, not a dead battery, not an obvious loose bolt, but a small relay failing when it cold shocked the system. It was the kind of thing that looked like nothing until somebody made it into something. As he worked, he could see the woman's profile softened by the cold. Her gloves were off, and she held them like an afterthought. He found himself walking the edge of a private place, familiar with hands and engines, but not with the walls people kept around them. He kept his voice even. "I can get it started," he said. "I'll have to jury-rig a relay for the drive. It won't be pretty, but it'll get you to town." She watched his hands move, and for a moment he thought he saw something tremble at the corner of her mouth. Suspicion? Or relief? Or the tired recognition that there were people who could still fix the small failures? "Thank you," she said. "I'm Susan Wright." He hesitated. Names were useful anchors in the weather. "Michael Turner," he said. "Turner's Garage." Of course. Her tone contained a map. She had heard the name somewhere. A neighbor's recommendation, an online review. She smiled the way people made an effort to be kind to those they suspected were working class. Carefully polished. "I'll wait." She waited, and while he worked, she fussed with her phone and then put it away. And somewhere between the jagged coughs of the engine and the steadying of the heater, the town's normal smallness settled over them like a blanket. He patched the relay with tape and wire that would not be the right repair for long, but it would close the gap until a proper part could be found. He tightened the last bolt until his palm complained, then turned the key. The engine answered with a clearer heart, and the hood lulled back into place with a sigh that was almost like agreement. She exhaled in a way that made him notice the day again. "You saved me," she said. "You saved Ava from a flat tire one summer," he might have said, because that felt like the other real language of his life, the ledger of favors and returns. Instead, he shrugged. "Guess I did." She looked around the garage like a person seeing a different world for the first time. Her coat brushed a calendar on the wall where, between photos of cars and service coupons, a faded sticker held firm. A crayon drawing of a red car, the pressure of a small hand still visible in the wax. Emily's drawing was the same shape. Earnest, large wheels, a sun that took up half the sky. He felt suddenly shy about the taped picture on his bench, as if his private weather had become public. "Is she yours?" Susan asked. "My daughter," he said. Saying it made the word heavier, as if placing it on the counter would make it impossible to pick up again. He had been a single father for more than 3 years now, since the hospital room had closed and the doctor had used soft words that never softened for long. He carried his wife's absence like a tool in his jacket, useful for certain tasks, heavy at odd times. He had learned to balance grief with payment due and groceries and the small ceremonies that mattered most to a 7-year-old. Pancakes on Sundays, the ritual of washing away the day together, the recitation of tucks and prayers and silly songs. "She's lucky," Susan said, "to have someone who fixes things." Michael wanted to say luck had nothing to do with it, that it was the ledger of choices and late nights. Instead, he said, "She thinks I'm a superhero when I fix a bike tire. That's enough for me." "Do you need help?" she asked suddenly, as if she were offering more than money. Her fingers fiddled with a leather strap of a bag she held close. It was the gesture of a person who had learned to measure generosity, to not give too little or too much. He told her the truth. He could use the money to buy winter tires for the truck, to pay a heating bill that would come due at the end of the month. He did not tell her about the letter from the bank that sat folded under a pile of invoices, nor about the way he sometimes lay awake and measured out the price of groceries in his head. He said instead, "You can pay cash if you want, or leave your card and I'll send you an invoice, whatever's easiest." She frowned at the idea of cash like it was archaic. "Let me pay your daughter a visit," she said, surprising him, as if she had hosted a sudden, intimate committee and voted in favor of curiosity. "I know a place nearby where she can get a cookie. Her voice trailed, and she reached into her bag and produced a small tin of shortbread, as if to make the offer concrete. Michael found himself measuring the implication of the offer. The town did not mistake help for intrusion. People offered pies like currencies. But there was something else in the gesture, a possibility that did not require him to explain his ledger. He watched Susan tuck the tin into her coat pocket. "Come by after school," she suggested, before he could respond. "If you'd like, I brought something for kids who get stranded." System. He held the card between his thumb and forefinger and thought of the relay he had jury-rigged, of Emily's drawing flapping in the draft, of the shortbread tin clinking in his toolbox. The ledger of debts and favors in his life felt suddenly less like arithmetic and more like an unfolding list, where kindnesses replaced numbers. He looked at the calendar and saw how the days mapped forward. Winter thawed into the hope of spring. A chance sat waiting like an unlatched gate. When he called, the voice on the line was brisk, the kind of efficient tone that built companies and kept meetings on time. "Turner's Garage?" it asked. "This is Michael Turner," he said. His voice felt small in the corporate echo. "Susan asked me to call." There was a pause long enough for a dozen questions to gather and be dismissed. "Ms. Wright mentioned you helped her when she was stranded," the voice said, and Michael could hear the meeting rooms in it. "We have a small problem with a line of vehicles in testing. Could you come by next week? Bring whoever you need." He had never been inside a corporate testing bay, much less asked to consult on a problem that sat beyond the town's oil and coffee economy. He thought of the radiator in his truck and the winter payments that liked to sit at the end of his month like an inevitable storm. He thought of Emily's small hand, the way it fit inside his palm. He thought of his wife's voice recited in the quiet corners of his days, "Do the work, take the call." He agreed. The arrangement felt like an impossible thing he had somehow been handed. The invitation to a place of glass and marble and decisions made by men whose signatures bought islands. He felt the old familiar prick of self-doubt, the thought that his dirt-under-the-nails honesty would not be welcome in a room of polished shoes. He told himself, as he always did, that competence did not require approval, only action. When he hung up, Michael walked to the window and watched Main Street go on. A few customers braved the cold to exchange greetings. Mrs. Klein from the bakery waved, her cheeks bright as cinnamon rolls. He pocketed the card and folded it like a talisman. Outside, the world continued on its ordinary axis, but something in the air had shifted. A possibility had arrived, small as a folded piece of paper and large as a promise. He did not know then how the invitation would tangle with the ledger of his life. He did not know, in the sober way of men who have been given too little and asked to continue anyway, that a single act, a relay taped with a grim kind of hope, a tin of shortbread left in a winter garage, could be the hinge on which years turned. He only knew that the engine had started when he turned the key, and that Susan Wright had left a line open. That night, as he sat at the kitchen table balancing invoices and listening to the slow, reliable breathing of Emily asleep in the room next door, he took the card from his wallet and smoothed it out. Emily's drawing lay beside it. He traced the childish sun and felt, for perhaps the first time since the funeral, the warmth of a day he had not planned and did not yet own. He folded the card and slid it under the clipped photograph he kept of his wife, a small, ordinary thing pressed against memory, and realized that the story had begun the moment a luxury car hesitated on a frosted street and someone chose to close the gap. The week that followed rearranged his days into a quick, electrified sequence. He prepared a list of tools, tightened the truck's latches, and taught Emily a new lullaby that she insisted he sing in 2 keys. On the morning he was to go to Orion, he packed a thermos of coffee, the rag with the grease pattern that had become a talisman, and a wrench that had been his father's. He dressed in clothes that did not pretend to suit the glass corridors he would enter. He owned his grease and his history too plainly to attempt camouflage. When he drove into the city for the appointment, the roads changed from the measured hum of Main Street to the slick, confident avenues of a place that moved at a different tempo. Buildings rose with mirrored faces, reflecting a sky that had not been altered but was arranged differently in glass. He parked at the perimeter and walked across a plaza where people in suits navigated conversations like dances. The testing facility's doors were heavy and cool, and when they opened, he felt, for a breath, as though he had stepped into a different grammar, stronger nouns, cleaner sounds, an economy of touch that spoke of power. Inside, he met Tom, the engineer whose skepticism greeted him like a calibrated instrument. Tom was all quick judgment and precise critique, the kind of man whose questions were designed to find fault and seal it in process. "We were told you can make things work," Tom said, hand clipped like a spring. Michael had grown used to being underestimated. It was a pressure that could either flatten a person or sharpen them. He answered with a sort of quiet that enlarged what he said, not in volume, but in accuracy. He listened, measured the problem, and walked to the line of cars with the steady step of someone who had spent years earning trust from metal. The vehicles were arranged like a chorus of possibilities. The issue, as Tom explained, was a new line of compact hybrids that had a stubborn electrical misfire under stress testing. Technicians had tried the manuals. The computers and the diagnostics had dressed the problem in jargon. The cars failed in a narrow band of temperature and vibration, the kind of thing that looked like noise, until someone with patience and an understanding of the body's small betrayals paid attention to it. Michael knelt and placed his palm on the chassis, feeling the residual warmth of tests and the tiny, misleading noises that machines made when they concealed a tired part. He thought back to the relay taped in his garage and let the memory be a method. His suggestion was unorthodox. Isolate the harness, allow for a small flex in the mount, move a contact point by a few millimeters. It sounded too simple, and to the polished ears of corporate problem solvers, almost insulting in its modesty. Tom's face tightened. "We've already run simulations," he said. "We've run stress cycles." "So have I," Michael answered. "But simulations don't always tell you how things feel. They miss the little shifts that happen when metal breathes under load. Let me show you." They ran the test. The car shuddered down the line, and then, under Michael's adjusted constraint, hummed through a cycle it had aborted before. The technicians watched charts spike and then find steady rhythm. Tom's critique slipped from sharp to something like consideration. The room smelled briefly of solder and warm plastic and the small, thrilling odor of an idea that might survive. When the lead engineer pulled Michael aside later, his expression had the softening of someone beginning to imagine gratitude. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. Michael shrugged. "Where I had to make things work, at home, with a kid. You learn to be practical." The lead engineer laughed, and the sound was like permission. "We'd like you to consult for a short run. Bring your truck, bring your tools." He drove home that night with the weight in his chest rearranged into something lighter. Emily met him at the door with a drawing of a car with wings. She wanted to know if the cars were magic. He said they're practical magic, and she accepted this as though it were a truth the world could be trusted with. When Susan came by the garage again, she did not bring shortbread. She brought a folder and a look that was less formal, more curious. They stood by the workbench, and for the first time Michael saw the guardedness around her begin to loosen like ice in warming water. She asked not about the cars, but about Emily's school, about the kind of evenings they had. He found himself answering in full sentences, not the clipped economy of commerce. She told him, in small staccato phrases, about the pressure of decisions and the hollow places success sometimes left in people. "You seem good at fixing things that should be fixed," she observed once, and there was no patronage in it, only recognition. He thought about the road he had come from, the muffled town, the funeral with its soft words, the kitchen table with its unpaid bills. He thought of the wrench his father had given him when he was 22, and how a man could shape a life with metal and will. He looked at Susan and saw, behind the precision, the shape of someone who had learned to be alone in rooms full of people. "Do you want help? Do you want help?" It was not the end of his troubles. It was a door, and it had opened. He slept with a small, simple plan. Call the number, go to Orion, do the work he knew how to do, and bring Emily cookies when he could. The rest he would let the world sort out. He woke to gray light and the thin smell of oil that never quite left the garage, like a memory that clung to cloth and wood. Emily was already awake, her small face nuzzled into the crook of the bench, as if the wrench itself were a pillow. He made coffee with hands that remembered the rhythm: measure, pour, steam. The plan was small and practical, the kind that fit on a napkin. Call Orion, set a meeting, show them what could be done with honest work and steady hands. The number Susan had given him was written on the back of a business card, sharp type and a logo that made a neat promise. He dialed twice before the line connected, and the voice that answered sounded like the city. Efficient, measured, full of rooms that knew how to close themselves off. Susan met him in a lobby that smelled faintly of citrus and new carpet. Orion's offices were high and glassed, and when the elevator took them up, the city contracted and focused into a placard of streets below.
Michael felt the weight of his denim and the oil under his nails, and wondered if he looked like someone who could be trusted with the neatness of that world. Susan walked beside him with the same calm she had shown in the garage, an interpreter of two very different languages. They were led into a meeting room whose table was wider than his life had felt for a long while. A man with a nameplate, Walker, sat at the head, the kind of person who had learned to lean forward and ask the exact question. Beside him was a woman who introduced herself as Claire, in charge of community projects. Her voice contained maps and budgets before anything else. There were charts on screens, neat lines of possibility. Michael wished he had something like that, charts to ease the shaky parts of proposals. Instead, he came with smell of oil and a stack of photos. The garage as it had been, the red car photo on the bench, a child's drawing she had given him that morning, two figures and a sun, heavy strokes of crayon that looked like hope done by hand. "Tell us what you want," Claire said. She wrote with a stylus in a way that made things irrevocable. He told them. He told them about small repairs that kept people from walking too long to the bus, about a place where kids could learn the trade rather than watch it dissolve into ticket counters and offices. He told them about Emily asleep on the bench and the plug of grief that sometimes filled the kitchen table in the evenings. He did not gloss the ledger. Orion's money could change the ledger, but it would not erase the fact of what had been.
He said he wanted the garage to be a place where people from town could gather without feeling judged, where someone could learn to hold a wrench straight and not be shamed for not knowing. Susan translated his sentences into the rhythms of the room. A community hub, apprenticeships, repair services on a sliding scale, training programs for young people. The phrases landed like blueprints. Walker's face did not change. He had listened to plans before. But Claire smiled in a way that suggested she could see exactly how that drawing of a sun might look on a plaque. "We can fund a pilot," Claire said after a long pause, "but we need assurance. We work at scale. We need standards, oversight, measurable outcomes." She tapped her tablet. "We'll require a scope, a timeline, a safety audit. We can provide materials and an initial grant. We'd like the first 6 months to be monitored." Michael nodded. He had expected conditions. It was practical to expect them. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. They wanted documentation, a plan for apprentices, references from the town, which he could get from Pastor Reed and Mrs. Gomez, and an agreement to allow Orion to visit and test certain protocols, sterile bays where they verified processes, and a cleaner, safer workflow. They wanted metrics, number of people trained, repairs completed, engagement with local schools. Michael promised what he could, careful with the edges of truth and hope. Then Claire asked quietly, "Could you work in our facilities for a trial? We'd like to see how you handle a complex repair under standardized conditions." The trial felt like a test of more than skill. It was a test of belonging. He agreed. Susan's look, encouraging, steady, was all the permission he needed. The Orion Test Center was a place of pale lights and stainless steel, the kind of room that made small dirty tasks look theatrical. He stood in coveralls that had never seen the grease of his bench and felt absurd until he was handed a task. A vintage carburetor, a part with stubbornness in its seams. The technicians observed politely. Michael worked with the same attention he gave everything that mattered. He traced threads, replaced a pitted jet,
filed a burr a precise fraction of a millimeter. When he finished, they ran the engine in a closed bay, listened to the rhythm, checked readings, nodded. The procedure was clinical and exacting. The difference between his world and theirs contained not in intention, but in tools and standards. When the readings matched their parameters, there was a small relaxation in the room, like a collective exhale. Back at the table, Walker asked the question that always comes after competence. If we fund this, can you keep the project independent? Will the town trust you to run it? Michael thought of the bench, of the way a community could be measured by the way it welcomed the broken. He said plainly, "I can promise honesty. I can promise to teach.
I won't let it become something that replaces the town," he added because it felt important. "But I will take the help when it keeps the doors open." They gave him conditional approval, materials, an initial grant, and a liaison, Danielle, who would check progress monthly. There were clauses and schedules that looked like fences. There were also signatures and a timeline that meant, at the very least, that the idea could begin to be visible. When he returned, the air of the town seemed thicker with possibility. He posted the meeting minutes on the community board and made the rounds, telling people in parts and in whole. Pastor Reed clasped his hand with a warmth that made Michael's chest loosen. Mrs. Gomez brought lemon bars as if to consecrate the moment in pastry. A few faces remained unreadable. The owner of the scrapyard, the woman from across the street who kept her blinds closed, Frank, who had run a repair shop on the other side of town, and who had once looked at Michael as competition, and now looked at him as a threat and a curiosity in equal measure. "You sure you want to do this?" Frank asked over a coffee one morning, leaning on the counter, like someone testing whether a new mark would dent the surface. His tone was not entirely unkind. "Corporations like that, what do they want? You sure they're not building something that looks like a handout and feels like a leash?" Michael answered as he had been learning to answer, plainly. "They want impact. I want people to learn. We'll keep it ours." He watched Frank for a shift in expression and saw it only dimly change. Part of Frank's worry was practical. Part of it was a worry about losing the only world he knew. The real obstacle came from a source Michael had not fully accounted for, the building itself. The inspector who came after they had measured skylights and counted exits had a clipboard and a vocabulary for risk. He walked through the garage with a sharp eye and a catalogue of reasons to hold back. At first it was small, an electrical junction that needed redoing, insulation that should be upgraded. Then, in a corner of the ceiling where the paint had peeled like old bark, he found something that made his pen pause. Traces of a material that would require abatement to remove safely. "Asbestos," he said simply. "Full abatement required before any public use." The word settled in the garage like dust. Abatement meant contractors, permits, time, money. Orion's grant covered materials for equipment and training, but not the cleanup of a building that had been standing since before Michael had been born. The inspector left a citation and a list of requirements. The bench looked suddenly like a stage set, beautiful in memory, forbidden until the right hands came in. For an hour, Michael stood in a light that filtered through the frost and felt the narrowness of his options. He could ask Orion to cover abatement. He could try to raise funds. He could let the idea slide into a polite memory. Each option had a cost larger than the next. He touched the wrench on the bench as if seeking counsel from an old friend, and thought of Emily's crayon son and of every child who might learn to hold a tool safely. He called Susan. Her voice on the phone was quick and then careful. "We can reallocate funds," she said, "but it will change the timeline. It will involve the facilities team and more oversight. Are you prepared for that?" Michael felt the weight of her question as if it were a lever. He could have been flattered. Instead, he heard the honest terms of partnership. "I am," he said, "if that's what it takes." She arranged for a meeting with Danielle and a structural team. They came with masks and clipboards and an efficiency that felt almost tender. The estimate for abatement arrived in sober figures, and it was more than he had imagined. It required a bridge, money short enough to make him worry, but not so much that it could not be found if the town chose to stand. That evening he called a meeting at the church hall. He had not planned on preaching, but standing at the old wooden lectern with Emily at his side and the town gathered in folding chairs felt like the right way to ask for help. Pastor Reed introduced him with a softness that made Michael's voice steady. He told them everything: the grant, the conditions, the inspection, the abatement. He did not make promises he could not keep. He asked for labor, for small donations, for someone with an old truck to haul materials, for anyone who could weld, paint, or offer a spare hour. He expected polite applause and a few sour faces. What he did not expect were the hands that went up, tentative at first, and then with more certainty. Mrs. Gomez, 3 teenagers from the school, a retired electrician, even Frank, who said simply, "If it helps the town, I'll chip in." After the meeting, while the hall emptied and the light outside had that late, forgiving blue, a woman came up to Michael and pressed a folded note into his hand. "For Emily," she said, "you do good." Her name was June. She lived 2 doors down and had worked in a factory for 30 years. Her note was small, $20 and a prayer, but it felt like a brick laid into a foundation. Fundraising became a kind of neighborhood weather. A cake sale at the library, a car wash organized by the high school, a modest grant from the Historical Society that wanted to preserve old buildings. Orion reallocated part of their grant to cover half the abatement, contingent on the town raising the remainder. Michael moved like someone learning to manage both wrenches and expectations. He filled out forms with help from Pastor Reed. He negotiated with contractors who had their own schedules and their own ways of speaking about risk. The days blurred between dust and paper, coffee and county offices where forms were stamped and witnesses signed. At night, Emily slept with her small hand curled around an imaginary gear, and Michael checked the bins of fasteners as if the right bolt might hold more than machines. There were setbacks. A contractor backed out at the last minute, citing a backlog. A donor changed her mind after a sudden illness. Someone spray-painted graffiti on the west wall, a crude attempt at humor that felt like an accusation. Each small blow gouged at his confidence, but each time someone else showed up. An extra pair of hands, a check in the mail, a message from Susan that read simply, "We're on schedule here. Don't let the small things sink you." The work moved forward in fragments. They sealed the contaminated corner, removed the old insulation with careful choreography,
replaced skylights that let in light like a blessing, painted the walls in a practical gray that made a clean background for tools and notices. Orion sent crates of tool sets and safety goggles. The school donated a set of metal tables. Emily's drawing, her son and two figures, was scanned and printed on a small plaque that would one day hang by the door, a quiet claim that this place belonged first to the town. There were evenings when Michael stood in the cleared center of the garage and felt as if he were watching his life rebuild itself in things that made sense. A clean floor, a bench bolted true, a shelf that held sockets like tidy teeth. Susan visited more often in those weeks, sometimes with papers to sign, sometimes with a box of donated parts. They worked side by side on small tasks, and there were moments when the professional boundary felt thinner, like pages pulled close in a book. He kept his hands honest and his words simple. On the morning the abatement certificate arrived, stamped and final, there was a small party, not for him, but for the place. Pastor Reed cut a ribbon with clumsy scissors. The plaque with Emily's drawing was affixed above the door. Children ran between the toolboxes and the recycled tires, making racetracks that smelled of rubber and possibility. The town had done it. They had paid their share with time, with money, with muscle. Orion's logo appeared on a modest sign near the entrance, but it was small and respectful, a hand beside the door rather than a banner that took over the porch. That night, as the sun went down and the last of the helpers left, Michael lingered. He ran his fingers along the bench where his wife's photo lay in its frame, now beside a stack of training manuals and a box labeled "Apprentice Kits." He thought of all the small openings that had led him here. The broken car, Susan's polished kindness, a child's crayon son. He smelled the oil and new wood together, and felt, finally, a kind of balance. Outside, the town clock chimed again, lower and more intimate than the city's glass towers.
He thought of board meetings yet to come, of the paperwork that would measure the garage against metrics, of the skeptical glances that would not vanish. He thought of the ledger and how it had transformed from a record of debts to a catalogue of small rescues. He set the wrench down and locked the door with the same care he had always given to the things he loved. There would be more difficulty ahead, certificates to renew, apprentices to train, promises to keep. But when he walked home with Emily's hand tucked into his, the street felt like a place that had shifted toward repair. He had not fixed everything, nor had he healed the ledger completely, but he had opened a door and learned how to hold it so others might pass through. The world did not rearrange itself in a single night. It unfolded slowly and kindly, one bolt at a time. They walked the short block in the thick evening air, Emily chattering about a cardboard racetrack she would build the next day. Michael listened, answering in the pauses between her bursts, and let the small conversation be the ledger that balanced him. At home, the kitchen smelled of bread and the slow steam of dishes. He set his keys on the counter, the metal clink a punctuation after the day's long sentence. Later, when Emily's breathing evened out in the dark, and the house settled around the quiet of ordinary things, Michael returned to the bench. The lamp over the work table threw a warm circle onto the worn wood. He opened the ledger and the bills again, laid out new invoices from the supplier, marked due dates with a pencil.
There were numbers that tugged at him like people in a crowd he could not comfort all at once. But at the end of the page he wrote a different list, names this time. Finn, who had come in with a bent bicycle and stayed to clean the floor. Rosa, who had shown up every Saturday to test the apprentice's welding. Marcus, who had taken apart his own worn toolbox to give hammers to the kids. Those names were a balance with the sums. The first cohort of apprentices began the following week. They were a patchwork, teenagers with eager hands, a middle-aged man named Pete who'd been laid off when the plant closed, a woman named Lila who had been single-handedly keeping her squeaking taxi in the road. Michael had learned to teach without arrogance. He found that showing the work more than telling it made better men and women of skill. He demonstrated the feel of socket and bolt, how to listen to metal for what it wanted. He coached small failures into careful success. When a student's weld cracked, he set aside his own impatience and showed the motion again, slow and steady, until the joint was honest. Word spread, and with it came small human miracles. A teenager paid for her driver's permit with wages earned from sharpening saw blades. Pete brought in a cake for the crew on his birthday and shed a single quiet tear when the apprentices sang. Michael watched those moments accumulate like coins.
They were not grand. They did not pay every bill, but they bought something like dignity. There were more tests. A late supplier shipment arrived soaked and unusable, and Michael argued for credit while trying to keep the apprentice's schedule intact. A city inspector called with questions about a permit that the town office had misfiled. At a board meeting, one of the counselors, an austere woman named Delaney, who liked rules as though they were armor, asked pointed questions about financial oversight. Michael felt the old ache of exposure in those rooms, a man who loved machines but had never loved the glare. Susan sat beside him in that meeting, not as advocate but as steady presence. When Delaney's voice rose, Susan's hand found his under the table and squeezed, a small anchor. Later, as the meeting broke and the rain had started outside, Susan walked him back to his car, carrying a plastic cup of coffee. They spoke of banalities, training schedules, a supplier's phone call, but each sentence moved in the space the other made, careful and unhurried. He found himself wanting to speak more freely, to name the ways the garage had changed him, but he kept his words practical. There were still ledgers to close and schedules to keep. Boundaries, like good tools, needed maintenance. The apprentice's first public demonstration coincided with the town's autumn fair. The garage set up a stall near the festival's bandstand, engines stripped to show inner lives, a bench where children could try a hand at simple tasks, a signboard listing courses and hours. Pastor Reed said a few words about work and worth. Orion sent 2 men to run a station on safety. When Emily mounted the small stage to present Michael with a painted wrench, her gift for Dada's Garage, the crowd laughed and clapped, and for a breath the ledger balanced itself in applause. After the fair, as they packed the last of the toolboxes back into the van, Lila hugged Michael and told him she had been accepted for a night shift course at the vocational college. Finn, wiping grease from his palms, promised to bring more kids next month. Michael tucked the painted wrench into a drawer beside his wife's photo.
It fit there like a small, bright hinge. That night, he locked the garage and walked home under a sky that seemed to have been cleaned by the rain. He felt the slow accumulation of small wins, leases negotiated, apprentices enrolled, neighbors who now borrowed a drill and returned it with a smile. The road ahead was not suddenly smoothed, but it had a worn and serviceable path. He thought of the ledger again, and of how some debts would never leave him. The hollow of loss, the nights that could not be repaired with bolts or fuel. Yet there were things he could fix, and in fixing them he felt an answering repair inside himself. He lay awake a while, cataloging the next day's tasks, then allowed sleep to come. In the morning, the list would be waiting, stubborn and simple.
He rose, set the kettle on, and readied himself to go back, because the place necessitated him, and because he had finally learned how to be needed in return.